everyone, it's Katrina. Ever feel like the world is hiding some seriously weird secrets? Well, buckle up because today we are diving headfirst into the unknown. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew because on Origins Explained, the truth is out there, somewhere. Creatures buried near the pyramids. Somebody call Stephen King and tell him his pet cemetery is real and it's been found. Archaeologists have found mummified animals buried in tombs near the pyramids of Giza. Despite popular rumors about hidden chambers within the pyramids containing exotic creatures or even extraterrestrial beings, recent archaeological excavations have, unfortunately, not substantiated these claims. Instead, these excavations have yielded a significant number of animal mummies, primarily from the Saqqara necropolis. These discoveries offer valuable insights into Egyptian beliefs and practices, particularly regarding their reverence for animals. Are you a cat person? According to Egypt's Antiquities Ministry, they found a whole ton of mummified cats buried at the foot of the Bastet temple. They also found the mummified remains of 2 lion cubs and 3 mummies that might be fully grown lions. While finding cats is fairly common, archaeologists discovering lions is extremely rare. Think of how much work must have gone into mummifying an actual lion. The Bastet temple in Saqqara was dedicated to feline worship. It was the place of the goddess Bastet, who can be found depicted in ancient Egyptian artwork as a woman with the head of a lioness or a cat. Bastet was the daughter of Ra, god of the sun. Here's a fun fact. Historians think that Bastet began to be worshipped at around the same time that cats were being domesticated, in 1500 BC. There were more animals found in Saqqara other than just those of the feline variety. 2 mummies of the Egyptian mongoose were found wrapped in linen bandages, along with statues of the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet was also depicted as a woman with the head of a lioness, only she was a goddess of war. Sekhmet was sort of like Ares from Greek mythology, but more feminine and a lot more feline. The Egyptians loved cats so much they turned multiple gods into cat hybrids. The most famous of all the cats loved by the Egyptians is the Sphinx, a mythical creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human. The Great Sphinx outside the pyramids of Giza is an excellent example of just how much the Egyptians loved their cats. Ancient reptilian humanoids. When archaeologists excavated the site of Tel al-Ubaid in Iraq at the beginning of the 20th century, they unearthed artifacts they couldn't explain. They found statues of unbelievable reptilian creatures dressed in strange space-age clothing. These might be actual statues of the alien gods who came to Earth and gifted primitive human beings with the knowledge they needed to start civilization. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. Scientists call these figurines the Ubaid lizard men, and they aren't the only ones that exist. There is evidence of reptilian humanoids all over the globe. Of course, they might not have been aliens, but there was definitely a human obsession with lizard humanoids. The lizard man statues found in Iraq amazingly predate ancient Sumer. Scientists say they were crafted by the Ubaidian culture, which appeared around 5500 BC. Nobody knows where they came from, only that they developed agriculture, architecture, and irrigation. These mysterious peoples sprouted from the ground like turnips and started building large villages and carving statues of lizard people. When I say they had architecture, I mean they had good architecture. Humans suddenly went from living in dark caves to paving their streets and building food processing equipment. It seemingly happened in the blink of an eye. Right at the same time, the lizard statues showed up. These lizard statues are crazy. Some of the lizard people are wearing helmets, like space helmets. Some of them are dressed in what almost look like royal robes with shoulder padding. And some of them are women holding little lizard babies in their arms. It's amazing because they don't look like they were supposed to be mythical creatures. The small figurines look like ordinary statues that would be crafted of men and women, only they have lizard heads. The lizard statues also appear to have elongated skulls, like the ones in this picture, courtesy of Mary Harsh. Notice the long conical heads on these lizard humanoids. It is startlingly similar to the elongated heads of the Paracas culture of ancient Peru, or of the ancient Egyptians, who often practiced cranial modification to give themselves pointier heads. Even the Maya artificially elongated their skulls to look more like the lizard folk. In antiquity, the longer your skull, the more likely you were to be an important member of society. Elongated skulls have always been associated with royalty and prestige. It makes sense if the practice was modeled after the lizard overlords who gave us civilization to begin with. Even certain Native American tribes performed the custom, and they almost certainly had no contact with the Sumerians. The Nomoli figures are another example of reptilian-like statues being found that make almost no sense. These ones were discovered in Sierra Leone, crafted by an unknown civilization that existed centuries ago, perhaps during the Middle Ages. What do you make of this reptilian mystery? And now for a quick break, because I wanted to give a big shout out to Kay Jacobson and Lily Fire for supporting this channel. Thanks so much! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about unexplained mysteries. Alexander the Great's hidden tomb. For over 2,000 years, a mystery has haunted historians and archaeologists alike. Where is the resting place of Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the ancient world? It's about time that somebody found Alexander the Great's tomb. Maybe if we put our heads together, we can sort through the evidence and find the most likely location for the ancient king of Macedon's final resting place. By the age of 32, Alexander had forged for himself an empire that stretched from the Balkans in Europe to Pakistan. It was one of the largest empires this world has ever seen. Good luck paying your respects to the dead ruler, though. No one has ever been able to find his burial place. Upon Alexander's death in the city of Babylon in 323 BC, chaos erupted. Alexander's rapid rise to power and his subsequent conquests destabilized the Persian Empire, leading to a power vacuum upon his untimely death. He had built such a huge empire, but Alexander was the glue holding it all together. When he died, his generals, each vying for control of his vast empire, engaged in a series of bloody civil wars known as the Wars of the Successors, or the Wars of the Diadochi. Alexander's empire fractured, with his generals each stealing one chunk for themselves. Ptolemy was the general who took Egypt, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. This would be the final dynasty of ancient Egypt and would end almost 300 years later with the death of Cleopatra VII. Rumor has it that Ptolemy brought Alexander the Great's body with him to Egypt, to the capital of Memphis in 321 BC. Historical records show that his body was kept in Memphis until a tomb could be built in the city of Alexandria to hold his body. Egyptologist Chris Naughton said that's about as far as the information anyone has goes. It's not clear when the tomb was going to be ready, if it was ever finished, or what happened to it. There are some vague records of a tomb being built, known only as the Soma in Alexandria. This mystery tomb seems to be the last one that held the Macedonian's body. But where is it? Some people think it's underwater. The ancient historian Strabo said Alexander's tomb was in the Palaces district, which archaeologists are pretty sure sank centuries ago. This is one mystery, as great as it is, that might never be solved. Chris Naughton said that in all honesty, there is a good chance that Alexander's tomb will never be found. But that's a pessimistic way to look at things. Other scholars do believe Alexander's tomb is going to be found, and soon. Former Egyptian Antiquities Minister Zahi Hawass said he thinks Alexander is buried somewhere in the area known as the Latin Cemetery in Alexandria. Another theory is that Alexander was buried in the mysterious Alabaster Tomb, a sizable tomb with no inscriptions on it whatsoever. The burial chamber dates to around the time Alexander died, and it's similar in design to tombs in Macedonia. Nobody knows who was buried in the tomb, but maybe it was Alexander. What are your thoughts? Is Alexander's tomb lost for good, or do you trust that archaeologists will find it? The American Cult and the Immortal Baby. One of the weirdest cults in American history tried to create an immortal baby. Did they really have secret knowledge that they picked up from studying ancient cultures, or were they all just crazy? If you've never heard of James Bernard Schaeffer and the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, buckle up for a wild ride. Not much is known about James' early life. He was born around 1896 in Fargo, North Dakota. He was a perfectly normal young man who studied at the University of Michigan and earned himself a medical degree. But James was also interested in metaphysics, and I should mention that he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. By the 1930s, James had managed to put together his cult and amass thousands of followers. Times magazine once described the royal fraternity of master metaphysicians as a theological goulash. They were a mishmash of self-help, Christian sciences, and faith healing, and they believed in some pretty, let's say, interesting things. For example, eating meat, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and consuming alcohol was considered bad for you. Alright, that doesn't seem too weird. But remember, this was the 1930s, when doctors still prescribed cigarettes to people complaining about lung pain. The weirder part was that each week, James, who at this point had everybody call him the messenger, gave his members a list of dietary guidelines. He told them what they could eat. James also told them that the cause of all illnesses, either mental or physical, stemmed from destructive thinking. Only positive thoughts could solve the problems in your life. The idea came that with the right positive thinking, death could be prevented altogether. In 1939, James announced that he and his cult would raise an immortal baby. Now, this sounds more like a vampire thing to me. They would use all they knew of metaphysics and positive thinking to raise a baby that would be unable to die. That baby came from Catherine Gaunt, who was too poor to afford to raise little baby Jean on her own. So the child was given to James. The child was taken to a mansion on Long Island, which James dubbed Peace Haven. There, the child's diet was strictly controlled. Cult members made sure she was not exposed to a single bad thought. Only positive words and good vibes allowed. I can't tell you how the experiment turned out because it was never completed. After 15 months, Catherine demanded to have her baby back. The experiment was abandoned, and a few months later, James was sued for grand larceny and sent to Sing Sing prison. Without him, the cult fell apart. Years later, in 1955, James was found dead in his car, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. As of 2002, baby Jean was reportedly alive and well. She had a family of her own, but would not speak about her bizarre history with the cult. We may never know if she will live forever. Finding aliens in outer space. Some of the most convincing UFO sightings have come not from our planet, but from outer space. Neil Armstrong supposedly encountered UFOs during the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. A few years earlier, during the Gemini 4 mission of 1965, Jim McDivitt spotted what he described as a white cylindrical shape out in space. But nobody else saw it because at the time, his partner, Ed White, was asleep. Come on, Ed. For the rest of his life, Jim maintained that it was an unknown piece of artificial debris that he saw. In other words, debris from a spaceship or a satellite, but obviously not human. Space journalist James Oberg argued that the debris likely came from the second stage of the Gemini itself when it launched into space. You might be more curious about what Armstrong saw when he went to the moon. He said that he witnessed two pale blue glowing orbs, which may have been flying saucers. However, these have been dismissed as nothing more than jettisoned components of the space shuttle. It's likely we'll never find out what exactly Armstrong saw before he took one giant leap for mankind. An exact quote is that he observed a light out the window that appeared alongside the crew. Weird. That's what astronaut Leroy Chiao reported seeing in 2005 during a spacewalk outside the International Space Station. Leroy described the light as being like an upside-down checkmark. While possibly a sighting of aliens, Leroy later changed his story and said that the lights were from fishing boats. That's weird. I didn't know the light from fishing boats was that visible to astronauts. There have been enough sightings in space to say it's entirely plausible our planet is like a magnet to aliens. What do you think? The secret treasure of the Alamo. The full story of the Alamo has yet to be told. There is a secret dating back to 1836 that is still waiting to be uncovered. During January of that year, a group of frontiersmen in southern Texas found themselves in possession of an immense amount of gold and silver. It was worth millions of dollars, even back then, which was serious cash. Because remember, back then, people made just a few bucks a month. The men of this party were led by Colonel Jim Bowie, and they were on their way to the Alamo. Their treasure was supposed to be for financing the Texas Revolution, to make Texas independent from Mexico. For those of you that are super young, before Texas was a state of the United States, it was part of Mexico. 2 months later, Jim Bowie and 188 men made their last stand at the Alamo against 6,000 Mexican troops. Among them was famous frontiersman Davy Crockett. Not a single one of the defenders survived, but their story will live on forever. This is the tale of the Alamo that most people are familiar with. But according to professional fortune hunter Frank Buschbacher, there is one important part missing. The treasure carried by Jim Bowie and his fighters has never been found. It might be more lost than Alexander's tomb. For 13 days, the Texans held the Alamo against the Mexican soldiers, but in the end, it was a hopeless effort. Frank said that in the final moments, Jim Bowie may have ordered that the treasure be hidden at the bottom of a well. But where is the well? Frank believes the treasure is located underneath the road in front of the Alamo Chapel. He believes it so much that Frank managed to get permission to excavate a small section of road. But the treasure wasn't there. 3.5 years of paperwork down the drain. It's a miracle Frank got permission in the first place, considering he was told the location of the treasure by a psychic named Maria Gomez. Maria also happens to be a museum curator who has never seen the Alamo. She told Frank that she had a vision of gold coins, silver artifacts, and religious trinkets being hidden at the bottom of an old well. Then Maria pointed to where the well was on a map, and that was where Frank dug. There were still artifacts discovered though, just not the treasure that everyone had been hoping for. Archaeologists started to find strange objects about 4 feet beneath the surface. They found Native American pottery smashed into fragments and also uncovered ancient cooking utensils and the bones of butchered animals. No gold, but evidence of Native American activity. Maybe the Alamo was built on a Native American burial ground and nobody knows it. As for the Alamo treasure, Frank is still convinced that it's buried in a well somewhere, but nobody knows where it is. The Great Forgotten African Kingdom. Archaeologists only recently started to study the largest prehistoric structure south of the Sahara Desert in Africa. This place is an enigma rolled up in 1,800 acres of crumbling stone ruins where 20,000 people used to live. In the Middle Ages, this was one of the greatest cities on the planet. I'm talking about Great Zimbabwe, a medieval capital that fell along with the kingdom that controlled it in the 15th century. But even after it was abandoned, the ancient Shona people continued using the epic ruins for ceremonies and rituals. Going back to the beginning, archaeologists are fairly certain that Great Zimbabwe was settled in the 4th century AD. It was the Shona who built the walls, mined the nearby iron, kept cattle, and established the city as capital of the mighty Kingdom of Zimbabwe. By the way, there are still 10 million Shona people around the world today, many of whom can most likely trace their ancestors to this very city. In the 11th century, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe was unstoppable. Almost half the gold in the world came from this one kingdom during its 300 years of rule. That is a serious amount of gold. Traders flocked to Zimbabwe from every corner of civilization, from places like Persia, Europe, and China. Great Zimbabwe was so big that it practically rolled over the landscape, spilling down into valleys and climbing up hills with its stone buildings. It took millions of raw stone blocks to create, without using a single drop of mortar. The oldest section of the city was also home to its king, looking down on the rest of the metropolis from his palace on a hilltop complex. The Great Enclosure is the name of the biggest structure in the city. It is considered the second largest structure in all of Africa by surface area, dwarfed only by the pyramids of Giza. It was in this huge enclosure where the king likely kept his many wives, children, and servants. For a blink in history, Zimbabwe ruled the world, but their supremacy didn't last forever. Great Zimbabwe was abandoned for reasons that are still unknown. Some say they ran out of natural resources and could no longer support their growing populations. Others claim the nearby kingdom of Mutapa took Great Zimbabwe by force in the year 1430 AD. Its ruins were never forgotten by the local Shona people, but the Kingdom of Zimbabwe itself seemed to be forgotten by the outside world. The first outsider to see the ruins was an American prospector in 1867. When the prospector later showed the ruins to German explorer Karl Malk, Malk refused to believe that they had been built by Africans. Fueled by the racist disbelief that Africans could build such a city, Western archaeologists for the next century attributed Great Zimbabwe to either the Phoenicians or the Babylonians, who they say built it as a second palace for the Queen of Sheba from the Bible. Why so many women's skeletons? At an ancient cemetery in Spain, archaeologists are stumped by a Halloween mystery. The research team found a terrifying imbalance in the burials of this prehistoric site. There are twice as many women's skeletons as there are men's. Something strange happened here, and scientists are struggling to make sense of it. The prehistoric graveyard is in Granada, and the ratio is way out of whack. Scientists have found 10 female skeletons for every 1 male skeleton, and the sample size is not small. Burial sites in the region have yielded over 55,000 skeletal remains, in some cases dating to 5,600 years ago. There had already been a lot of research done at the prehistoric site and its neighboring graveyards, but nobody ever knew if the dead were men or women. It wasn't until researchers used a new bioarchaeological technique that they hit the jackpot. Their new technique is able to analyze DNA and a specific protein found in tooth enamel. Now, scientists can easily tell a male from a female, even if all that remains are bones. What scientists found was a stark imbalance between men and women across all ages, which is pretty shocking because human populations typically have a 1-to-1 ratio of men to women. The only frequent exceptions are in times of war or during mass migration. In that case, you typically find far more men's graves. This is the opposite, and it's kind of alarming. Scientists think there was a deliberate social decision to have far more women in society than men. This staggering number of female graves doesn't mean that there were more women dying. It means that there were just more women. Way more. If polygamy had been a thing, each man could have comfortably had 9 wives and none of his neighbors would have been jealous. Scientists have tried to come up with an explanation for the skeletons. They said that maybe the Stone Age civilization was a matrilineal society. In other words, their identity was determined through the maternal line rather than the paternal one. Or the men were just really into having multiple wives. Blue-eyed giants of America. Did you know there used to be giants living on Catalina Island off the coast of California? If the myths are to be believed, they were huge, pale, and had blue eyes. Catalina is about 22 miles away from LA. In 7000 BC, the island was home to the indigenous Gabrielino Indian tribe. When the Spanish arrived in 1542, they colonized it, and the island came under the jurisdiction of Mexico, then later the United States. In 1896, the Glidden family moved onto the island. They had a young son named Ralph, who one day discovered the skull of a Native American buried in the sand. After that, Ralph became obsessed with finding more ancient remains. He continued searching the island well into his adulthood. From 1919 to 1928, Ralph supposedly found 800 graves and twice as many artifacts. What did Ralph do with all his bones and relics? He sold them to anyone who would buy them, including museums and private citizens. Ralph had no shortage of buyers because the bones he found were not always human. Ralph discovered more than one skeleton belonging to someone who stood over 9 feet tall. There was a problem, though. The skeletons didn't want to remain solid. When Ralph tried to remove the oversized skeletons, they would often break into dust like a vampire in sunlight. There were other curious researchers who also found skeletons on the island of giant humans. They too had the same problem, with them turning into dust. Ralph started telling people he had proof that the giants were a fair-skinned race who lived 3,000 years ago. Ralph said that he once found a skeleton of a young girl giant surrounded by 64 children's skeletons. It was as if the children had been sacrificed in the girl giant's honor. On the nearby island of Santa Rosa, giant skeletons were allegedly found in 1959. Some of the skulls had double rows of teeth and 6 digits on their hands and feet instead of 5. They weren't just big people. They were obviously from another race of beings altogether. In 1913, German naturalist Dr. A.W. Furstenen unearthed a skeleton 8 feet long on the island of Catalina. During his investigations, he learned of a legend which said that in ancient times, a giant race occupied the coastal islands of California. The race mysteriously disappeared long before Europeans arrived. With all the skeletons that have supposedly been found, there should be some left, right? But there isn't. Nobody knows what happened to all the giant skeletons found in California. Some say they were destroyed on purpose, and some say they simply turned to dust. What do you think happened? Let me know in the comments. The Tomb of the Unknown. In 2005, an unknown tomb was discovered in Egypt's Valley of the Kings for the first time since King Tut in 1922. Almost 20 years later, and the tomb is still one of Egypt's greatest mysteries. Let me give you a quick recap on why the Valley of the Kings is so important, besides the kings being buried there. During the New Kingdom between 1539 and 1075 BC, pharaohs like Tutankhamun, Seti I, and Ramses II chose to have their tombs in this extensive valley. Other people were buried here as well, such as the queens of those kings and their high priests. Evidence from inside their tombs proves that the pharaohs had prepared themselves for godhood. With help from their trusty embalmers, they were hoping to continue their life on the other side of the door, so to speak. Mummification was necessary to preserve each pharaoh's body, so that in the afterlife their eternal soul would be reanimated. If you weren't mummified, your soul couldn't reach the afterlife. Naturally, the rulers of Egypt took their treasures with them to the next life. They had their tombs filled with gold and trinkets and jewelry and spellbooks. The tombs were provisioned with food and drink, including wine, so that they could party hard when they got to eternal salvation. Sometimes pharaohs were buried alongside their favorite people, like their attendants, and sometimes with their pets, often baboons or hunting dogs. More than 62 tombs were found within the valley prior to Tutankhamun in 1922. A century later, in 2005, archaeologist Otto Schaden found an unknown tomb right next door to King Tut. The new tomb was only 50 feet away. Inside the mystery tomb, researchers found empty sarcophagi and flowers, but that was pretty much it. Someone had robbed the joint long before the 21st century. All these years later, nobody has any idea who was buried in the tomb, not so much as a hunch. This tomb, just like most of the original 62 before Tutankhamun, had likely been robbed thousands of years ago. In 60 BC, Greek writer Diodorus Siculus visited the Valley of the Kings on a mission, and he wrote, "We found nothing there except the results of pillage and destruction." Angry birds in ancient China. A groundbreaking archaeological discovery has unearthed a connection between ancient Chinese civilizations and a popular contemporary game. A clay figurine dating back thousands of years mirrors the iconic green pig from Angry Birds. Did the people who make Angry Birds like ancient Chinese history? I mean, I don't know, but how else do you explain the uncanny similarities between the clay figurine and the character? Archaeologists explain it using logic and science. According to the research team, they found the clay figure near the Sanxingdui ruins, one of the strangest places in China. They also said that statues of pigs were common during the Shang dynasty of 1600 to 1046 BC. Pigs were kept as domestic animals, so people made adorable clay figurines of them. The fact this figurine looks like the Angry Birds pigs is probably a coincidence. Still, there is more going on here than just cute cartoon birds. Not far from the village is Sanxingdui, a place that has yielded some of the most bizarre treasures ever found on Earth. For example, the giant bronze heads that look like recreations of aliens. You can see some of them on display at the Hong Kong Palace Museum. At first glance, you'd be forgiven if you mistook the masks for Aztec. The huge sculptures look sort of Mesoamerican, but they are 100% Chinese. They date to about the same time as the Angry Birds figurine, so about 3,000 years ago. Researchers think the masks were crafted by the Shu Kingdom, which oddly enough was thought to be a myth until the ruins of Sanxingdui were accidentally found by a farmer in the 1920s. Now, scientists know the Shu Kingdom was real. They ruled China's Chengdu Plain from about 4,800 until 2,800 years ago. The large masks aren't the only things found that look sort of alien inside the ruins. Archaeologists also discovered small figurines, not completely unlike the Ubaid lizardman figurines from Iraq. They are less reptilian, though, and more freaky mutant alien. The Sanxingdui artifacts predate the terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang by at least 1,000 years. Nobody knows what the figures represent or why the Shu Kingdom crafted such large, strange masks. The whole culture vanished in 800 BC, leaving Sanxingdui a ghost town.
Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
The sword in the monastery. An archaeology student visiting a Venetian monastery noticed a sword on display that didn't quite seem to fit. The ancient sword was believed to be just a few hundred years old, displayed by the monks at the monastery as part of their museum. But the student was insistent that the weapon was much older. Her name is Vittoria dal Armelina from the Ca' Foscari University in Venice. In 2017, she insisted that a proper analysis of the sword be done to see how old it truly is. As it turns out, the sword dates back about 5,000 years, and nobody has any idea how it managed to get where it is today. What we do know is that 5,000 years ago, swords were invented in eastern Turkey. It was the first time humans picked up a blade with the intention of using it for combat. But how it got to the monastery is the real mystery. The university contacted the monastery for more information, and they revealed that Armenian Catholic monks had been residing there since 1717. This sword had been a gift from an art collector 150 years ago. The art collector had procured the sword from parts unknown. It's believed it could have been discovered at Kavak, the location of an ancient Greek colony in Turkey. But its exact journey from being handcrafted 5,000 years ago in the Bronze Age to being put on display at a Venetian monastery in the 18th century will probably never be pieced together. Roman iron mask. An archaeological mystery may have just been solved with the help of some very interesting Roman remains discovered in Turkey as well. Archaeologists unearthed the partial remains of an iron mask from the days of Rome. The rusted artifact was uncovered thanks to excavators with the Karabukh University at the site of Hadrianopolis. It was once one of the biggest settlements in the area, inhabited from between the 1st century BC to the 8th century AD. But anyways, back to the mask. It's exactly what you think an iron mask would look like, a Halloween-style mask wrought of iron. Masks exactly like this were probably worn by Roman cavalry 1,800 years ago. The masks were used to protect the face and neck of the warriors as they charged into battle. But until this discovery, historians hadn't been entirely sure. The mystery was that they couldn't figure out if the masks were only used as part of some kind of ceremony or indeed for war. But because this iron mask was found in an ancient military installation, it looks like the mystery has been solved. Now, just try to imagine hundreds of Romans in chariots adorned with terrifying iron masks, all of them charging across the field of battle to slaughter your tribe. Wiped out Roman legions. Experts working at the archaeological site of Kalkrisi in Germany recently discovered a fully preserved cuirass that once belonged to a Roman soldier. According to the director of the museum, the piece of armor is the oldest and most complete of its kind ever discovered, and that makes the discovery both tragic and unique. The armor undoubtedly belonged to a soldier who died during the epic Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. This battle was more of a massacre than anything. 3 legions of Roman soldiers were walking through the forest when they were ambushed by Germanic tribesmen. It was one of the greatest military defeats in Roman history. 15,000 soldiers were slaughtered in a very short period of time. The Germanic barbarians burst out of the forest and massacred everyone, although the Romans probably deserved it. Now you're probably wondering where the mystery is. It's not necessarily the battle, but what happened to the Roman soldier that's mysterious. He was found along with his armor with a device that had been used to lock his wrists in an iron board. He may have been part of a sacred ritual, meaning he was probably alive when the fighting was over. The Germanic tribe kept him to be sacrificed in an unknown and probably extremely brutal ritual. It's why they left his armor alone. It probably would have been tainted by the ritual. Ancient human species. Scientists believe they have uncovered the remains of a new human species. The discovery actually happened about 90 years ago, and it wasn't scientists, but rather a Chinese construction worker who uncovered a fossil from 146,000 years ago. It was a human fossil, actually a preserved skull. But for almost 90 years, nobody had known what humanoid creature the skull belonged to. It was a total mystery. At the time the skull was discovered in 1933, the area was under Japanese rule. The construction worker found the skull while building a bridge. He smuggled it back home, believing it may have cultural value. When he arrived, he hid the skull at the bottom of his family well, but he never told to anyone until just a few years ago on his deathbed. His family then went and got the skull from the bottom of the well and handed it over to scientists. After analyzing the skull with the newest forensic technology, scientists determined that the cranium could have belonged to a previously unknown human species. According to scientists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, it's one of the most complete skulls they have ever seen. The mysterious person whom the skull once belonged to has been nicknamed the Dragon Man. One of the reasons is that his skull seems to be among the biggest of any species of human. Scientists believe he may have belonged to a sister group of Homo sapiens, creatures very similar to us, but with larger and more primitive features. The mysterious Median Empire. Archaeologists in Iran recently uncovered the remains of a prehistoric military fortress in Tepe Rivi. This is in the North Khorasan province, with the fortress being dated back about 2,700 years. Back then, the area was ruled by the Median Empire. But the Median Empire is so obscure that they are barely more than a myth. As far as we know today, the Medes occupied an area they called Media in the 11th century BC. This was a mountainous region of Iran and Mesopotamia. They appeared sometime in the 8th century, though nobody actually knows for sure. Their capital was the city of Ekbatana, what is today the modern city of Hamadan. And here's where things get really mysterious. The ancient city of Ekbatana is still considered to be a riddle, because it's completely buried under the modern city, which has never been excavated. This means that anything scientists want to learn about the mysterious Median Empire is out of reach, buried directly underneath homes, businesses, and streets. The new discovery of the fortress simply proves that the enigmatic Median Empire had probably existed with governments and a fairly beefy military. But what happened to them after the year 625 BC is still largely unknown. The origin of Native Americans. Until recently, archaeologists and anthropologists were fairly certain that the original Native Americans who migrated into North America did so from Japan. Specifically, the first people who ever lived in North America were believed to be descendants of the Jomon, a people who occupied Japan 15,000 years ago. This was around the same time, although the exact dates have been highly debated in recent years, that people were migrating to North America via the Bering Land Bridge. A new discovery has flipped this hypothesis on its head. Scientists are now saying that the biological evidence does not match up with previous archaeological findings. G. Richard Scott from the University of Nevada says the Jomon of Japan have absolutely no ancestral links to Native Americans. Instead, the Jomon are more closely related to Southeast Asians in places like Thailand and Cambodia, as well as East Asians in China and Korea and Pacific Islanders. Now, here comes the mystery. Since Native Americans weren't descendants of the Jomon, then who? Scientists are now speculating that they came from a different group living somewhere in East Asia. They just don't have any idea of where or who. The Alien Pharaoh. Akhenaten is one of the most mysterious figures in history, mostly because he may have been an alien. First, let's take a look at the facts. Akhenaten was the 10th ruler of Egypt during the 18th dynasty. He's most famous for his bizarre appearance, having a seemingly elongated head and extremely large features, while also looking oddly feminine. But he's also famous because he tried to drastically change the religious order of ancient Egypt during his rule. He moved the capital from Thebes to Amarna and established the cult of Aten that would specifically worship the sun. Not exactly the sun itself, but the sun disk, which was an aspect of the god Ra. Ra was to be the one and only god, and all the others were to be ignored by the rest of the Egyptians. The people were not very happy with this change, and there was much civil unrest. The pharaoh changed his name from what it was originally, Amenhotep IV, and became Akhenaten. He ruled for 17 years, completely disrupting Egyptian life, and then died. When his son Tutankhamun took over, he got rid of the cult of Aten and reintroduced all of the ordinary Egyptian gods. The reason some people believe the pharaoh was an alien has a lot to do with the way he looked. In pretty much every depiction of him, he looks like a modern-day alien. He's skinny with a protruding belly and large eyes that take up way too much of his extremely large head. And why did he look and act so strangely? Plus, there was allegedly a medallion found in an Egyptian temple that showed the pharaoh Akhenaten with a UFO hovering above him. There have been many other weird artifacts found surrounding this pharaoh, and many of them seem to suggest he was at least in cahoots with a race of extraterrestrials. The oldest English coin. An archaeological dig in the Canadian province of Newfoundland has unearthed what could be the oldest English coin in Canada. William Gilbert, the head archaeologist involved in the project, says the smaller silver coin he and his teammates uncovered was minted between 1493 and 1499. The coin itself is known as a Henry VII half-groat. It's about the size of a nickel and was minted in Canterbury in the United Kingdom. The mysterious coin was discovered at the Cupid's Cove Plantation Provincial Historic Site. This site was the location of one of the earliest English settlements anywhere in North America. It was settled by a merchant from Bristol named John Guy in the year 1610. It's no surprise that the oldest coin would come from the oldest settlement. But how that coin came to be there is still a mystery, mainly because it was minted 100 years before the settlement was even founded. The next most recent coin found here was from 1560. So the question is, what happened in all of those years in between? Lost indigenous settlement. A team of archaeologists claim to be fairly certain that they have discovered the location of a lost community of indigenous people who once thrived in the northeast part of Florida. Mention of this mysterious settlement appears in historical documents from both France and Spain, dating as far back as the 1560s. But for decades, the actual location of the mysterious community has eluded researchers. Now, a team from the University of North Florida says they have probably found the settlement. They found the remains as part of the Mocama Archaeological Project. For those who don't know, the Mocama were some of the first indigenous people to encounter Spanish settlers during the 1560s. They were also some of the first people to encounter brutal warfare with the British, infectious diseases from European colonization, and all of that historical terribleness. They were also completely wiped out by the Europeans, with no trace of them left today. This is why discovering their settlement is so important. The archaeological team has found 50 pieces of Spanish pottery, stone artifacts, bones and shells, and fragments of what were probably houses. Excavations are ongoing for the next 3 years, so hopefully the mystery will soon be solved. Non-returning boomerangs. Boomerangs have been used by indigenous people in Australia for at least 20,000 years. This is based on cave paintings found depicting boomerangs that have been dated back that far. The oldest discovered boomerang is only 10,000 years old, but that's because boomerangs were traditionally made from wood and don't stand up very well to the test of time. Recently, a pair of workers with the National Parks and Wildlife Service in South Australia found 4 boomerangs. They dug them out of a dry creek bed during the middle of a drought. They had been there for about 400 years, yet were in surprisingly good condition. The mystery behind the boomerangs is that they weren't designed to return to the person who threw them. We all know that when you throw a boomerang, it's supposed to come back to you, but all 4 of these weren't designed that way. This became a huge mystery as archaeologists scrambled to figure out why the Aboriginals would have wasted their time with non-returning boomerangs. To understand the mystery a bit better, we need to look at what boomerangs were used for. They were typically used as projectiles for hunting and fighting. But as it turns out, boomerangs may have also been used as multi-tools. They could have been used in ceremonies, as shovels for digging, and for a whole host of other tasks. The truth is that we don't know why these boomerangs were designed not to return. They may have been used as hammers, clubs, or could have just been failed models that were thrown into the creek as trash. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!